On the 20th of May 1631, a great and ancient city that had defied emperors for 100 years was wiped from the face of the earth in a single day. Behind its walls, 30,000 people had held out for months, certain that the greatest champion of their faith was marching to save them. Before those walls waited an imperial army that had run out of patience, and a rescue that would arrive just days too late. When the last defense was broken, the soldiers were let loose upon the city, and within hours Magdeburg was a sea of fire. By nightfall, as many as 20,000 of its people were dead, and a city of 30,000 had fewer than 5,000 souls left alive. This is the story of the losing side. To understand what burned that day, you have to understand what Magdeburg had once meant. For centuries, it had stood on the banks of the river Elbe, in the very heart of Germany, one of the largest and richest cities in the Holy Roman Empire. It was a free city, proud and self-governing, answering to no lord but the distant emperor and its own council of burghers. Its great cathedral rose high above the rooftops, and its markets drew merchants from across the north of Europe. But Magdeburg was famous for something greater than its wealth. 100 years before, when a monk named Martin Luther split the Christian world in two, Magdeburg had been among the first cities to embrace the new Protestant faith. It became such a stronghold of the Reformation that men called it our Lord God's Chancery. When an earlier emperor tried to crush the Protestants by force, Magdeburg alone had shut its gates and defied him, and it had won. For generations after, the city remembered that it had stood against an emperor and survived. That proud memory would help to doom it. For by the year 1618, all of Germany had been plunged into the most terrible war it had ever known. It began as a quarrel between Catholic and Protestant princes, and it swelled into a monstrous struggle that would last 30 years. Armies of mercenaries marched back and forth across the land, living off whatever they could burn, steal, or destroy. At the head of the Catholic cause stood the Holy Roman Emperor, Ferdinand II, a ruler determined to return all of Germany to the old faith. One by one, his great generals smashed the Protestant armies and stripped the Protestant princes of their lands. By the end of the 1620s, the emperor's power reached its height, and the Protestant cause seemed all but lost. Then Ferdinand ordered the Protestants to hand back a century of church lands, and the whole north of Germany trembled with fear and anger. It was into this darkness, in the summer of 1630, that a new and unexpected champion stepped ashore. From across the Baltic Sea came the King of Sweden, Gustavus Adolphus, the man they would call the Lion of the North. Gustavus was the finest soldier of his age, and he landed on the northern coast of Germany with a small but disciplined army to defend the Protestant faith. To the desperate Protestants of the north, he seemed like a deliverer sent by God himself, and no city welcomed the news of his coming more eagerly than Magdeburg. Remembering its proud defiance of emperors past, Magdeburg became one of the very first cities to rise up and declare for the Swedish king. The city threw off the emperor's authority, raised the banner of revolt, and placed all its hope in the promise of Gustavus Adolphus. Gustavus, for his part, swore that he would not abandon the city that had trusted him first. But between the king and Magdeburg lay 100 miles of hostile ground, and time was not on the city's side. The emperor could not allow so great a city to defy him and live. He sent against it the most feared army in Germany, the army of the Catholic League, led by the old and ruthless Count Tilly. Tilly had never lost a battle, and his soldiers had left a trail of burned towns across the empire. In the autumn of 1630, his forces closed around Magdeburg, and the great siege began. To help hold the walls, Gustavus sent the city one trusted officer, a determined soldier named Dietrich von Falkenberg. Falkenberg took command of the defense, organized the citizens, and worked to keep their courage alive through the long months ahead. For the king had sent his solemn word that a relief army was coming, and all the city had to do was hold on until it arrived. If a doomed city holding out for a rescue that never comes moves you, take 1 second to subscribe and back to the walls. So Magdeburg settled into wait and to endure. Through the winter and into the spring, Tilly's guns pounded the city's defenses while his soldiers tightened their grip. The people of Magdeburg manned the ramparts, repaired the damage each night, and beat back every probing attack. Food began to run low, and the crowded city filled with refugees who had fled the countryside for the safety of its walls. Still they held, week after week, their eyes turned always to the horizon, watching for the banners of the Lion of the North. But the King of Sweden could not come. To reach Magdeburg, Gustavus had to march across the lands of two great Protestant princes, the electors of Brandenburg and Saxony, and those two princes, terrified of the emperor's wrath, refused to let the Swedish army pass through their territory. For weeks Gustavus argued, threatened, and pleaded with them, while the days slipped away and Magdeburg slowly starved. The king would not throw away his only army by marching it into a trap with hostile powers at his back. And so, mile by mile, the rescue that Magdeburg was counting on ground to a halt. Inside the city, the defenders did not know how close their salvation had come, nor how completely it had stalled. Falkenberg kept the danger to himself and went on promising his exhausted people that help was near. By the middle of May, Tilly's own supplies were failing, and the old general knew he could not keep up the siege much longer. He resolved to stake everything on one great assault before he was forced to retreat. On the night of the 19th of May, an eerie calm fell over the siege lines, and the guns fell silent. Inside Magdeburg, the exhausted defenders took the silence as a sign that Tilly was giving up, and for the first time in months, they let themselves hope. Many left the walls to sleep, believing the danger had passed, and the watch on the ramparts grew dangerously thin. It was the worst mistake the city could ever have made. In the grey dawn of the 20th of May, 1631, the whole imperial army rose up and hurled itself at the weakened walls. Tilly's fierce cavalry general, Pappenheim, drove his men against a stretch of rampart left almost undefended. Before the sleeping city could rouse itself, the attackers were over the walls and pouring into the streets. Dietrich von Falkenberg rushed to the breach with what few men he could gather and was cut down as he tried to throw the enemy back. With their commander dead and the enemy inside, the last defense of Magdeburg fell apart. The gates were thrown open, and the full weight of the imperial army flooded into the city. Some of the townsfolk fought on from house to house, but the battle was already lost. By mid-morning, 30,000 people lay at the mercy of an army that had no mercy to give. What followed was one of the most terrible massacres in the history of Europe. The soldiers, unpaid and enraged by the long, hard siege, were let loose upon the helpless city. They cut down men, women, and children in the streets without distinction and without pity. The people fled to the churches to beg for sanctuary, and were slaughtered before the very altars. And then, in the midst of the killing, fires broke out across the city, fanned by a rising wind. The flames leapt from house to house, until the whole of Magdeburg was ablaze. The greatest city of northern Germany became a single vast funeral pyre, its streets choked with smoke and the dying. By the time the fires had burned themselves out, almost the entire city had been reduced to blackened ash. Of some 30,000 people, as many as 20,000 were dead, and their bodies were thrown into the Elbe to clear the ruins. Only the great cathedral and a handful of buildings still stood, where a few thousand terrified survivors had sheltered. For 14 days the victors labored just to clear away the corpses, and the once mighty city was left a silent, smoking graveyard. The soldiers grimly joked that they had held a wedding, and for centuries after, the horror was remembered as the sacrifice, or the wedding, of Magdeburg. When news of the destruction spread across Europe, it sent a wave of horror through Protestant and Catholic lands alike. The name of Magdeburg became a byword for total ruin, and to Magdeburg eyes a place came to mean to wipe it utterly from the earth. But the very atrocity meant to break the Protestant cause instead set it ablaze with fury and resolve. Protestant Germany, which had wavered and held back, now rallied to the Lion of the North in grief and rage. That autumn, Gustavus Adolphus met the dreaded Count Tilly in open battle at Breitenfeld, and shattered his army at last. The old general who had never lost a battle was broken by the very anger that Magdeburg's ashes had lit. But no revenge could give the city back its dead, and the war would grind on for another 17 terrible years. Magdeburg itself lay empty and ruined for a generation, its walls silent and its houses cold, a ghost on the banks of the Elbe. It had trusted in a rescue that could not reach it in time, and it had paid with almost every life within its walls. This has been the story of the losing side.